The problem of divine hiddenness. The problem of divine hiddenness is a problem, it is argued, for the existence of God. Why wouldn't God make his existence more obvious if he really did exist? We would expect to see him more clearly if he really is there at all. In some ways, I think this argument is becoming more central to the cumulative case for atheism than the old problem of evil. It behooves us then to take a look-see at it. As a reductio ad absurdum, the argument against the existence of God from divine hiddenness may be expressed as follows. 0. God exists. 1. God wants everyone to believe in him. 2. God is omnipotent. 3. Hence, not everyone believes in God if and only if there is no God. 4. But not everyone does believe in God. 5. So we can only conclude there is no God, but 0 contradicts 5. So 0 is that God exists. 5 is that that God does not exist. As somebody who actually does believe in God, I want to be careful that I'm not being biased in my presentation of the argument. I don't want to knock down a straw man. So I wanted to make this argument fairly and strongly, as strong as I could, and not let my bias get in the way. It seems to be formally valid and the premises are prima facie plausible. But if God really does exist after all, as I believe as a Christian, contrary to what this argument claims, it claims that there... Let me start over. But if God really does exist after all, contrary to what this argument claims, then we must be able to scratch below the prima facie surface and find a problem somewhere. The argument, if sound, proves there is no God, but as a theist, I cannot accept this conclusion. Since I am rational, however, I must find a problem with the presumably valid argument. In other words, I must find that one of the premises are not true. Since I am a theist and rational, as I said, I must find a problem with one of the premises. Why is the argument unsound? In other words, before assessing whether this argument is sound, we must understand it, and this is not easy to do, for I would say that premise 1 is ambiguous. So again, premise 1, God wants everyone to believe in him. What do we mean by what God wants or by God's will? Does God want us to sin? Well, no, God does not want us to sin, yet he does allow us to sin. He is omnipotent, so he could prevent us from sinning, and it may be that he does not want us to sin. He doesn't want us to sin, yet we do in fact sin. These considerations about God being holy and omnipotent but allowing us to sin have led theologians to distinguish between different senses of the term will when applied to God. First, theologians speak of the permissive will of God. The permissive will of God is the sovereign choice of God to allow what actually does happen to happen. It is God's will, we could say, that we sin if we ourselves choose to sin. God does not condone our evil deeds, nor does he like it when we sin, but it was God's will to create us with a free will, and since we have a free will, we are free to choose evil. That is the first sort of God's will, what he sovereignly allows to happen. Sometimes we say, well, it was part of God's plan that this happened. Some tragedy occurs. Well, this fits into God's plan somehow, though we don't understand how. That's talking about the permissive will. That's the first sort of will, what God sovereignly allows to happen, what it is his will to permit. The second sort of will is God's perfect will. The perfect will of God is what God wants to happen. The ideal of what God would like to see happen is his perfect will. His permissive will is that we sin if we choose to sin, but his perfect will is that we are holy. His intention is that we are holy. His ideal is that we are holy. His wish is that we are holy. But in his permissive will, he allows us to behave in ways that he would rather we did not. So he allows us, he permits us to sin, but his perfect will is that we don't sin. All right, so the question is it God's perfect will, or is it his permissive will that is in view in premise 1? Normally, the atheist does not make this explicit, but the permissive will of God is what God permits, but perhaps does not in an ultimate sense want to happen. He permits us to sin and so on, which he doesn't really like. So he does allow things to transpire which he does not like under his permissive will. So if we first admit that God allows things to happen which are contrary to his perfect will, then we have to admit that it is at least possible that God does not permissibly will that all persons believe in him. It may seem strange to believe in God and at the same time to believe it is against his permissive will that all believe, but it is possible, and that is enough to make the argument as a whole deductively unsound. I should like to add, too, the observation that it seems strange to me, even as a theist, that God would allow us to commit the acts of sin which he himself detests so much. If that is hard to understand, and it is, then it is equally hard to understand why God would allow unbelief. In other words, if I can accept the one hard-to-understand fact as being true, I should accept the other. We do not have to understand the mystery. We do not have to understand the mysterious ways that God works in. In other words, the permissive interpretation of premise 1 makes the argument unsound, for reasons I've just said, so I shall assume the atheist means perfect will in this context. I want to give the argument the best chance of succeeding, as I said earlier. But even with this clarification that the perfect will of God is in view, premise 1 is still ambiguous. I mean to ask, what is the meaning of the term belief? Usually this word means one thing when a Christian is describing their own faith, and something totally different when an atheist is describing that very same faith of that very same Christian, and this leads to a lot of confusion in dialogue between Christians and atheists. So I need to distinguish between the two senses of the word belief, and then see which one fits the argument from divine hiddenness against the existence of God. I will begin there in video number 2. Thank you.